Starting off, we have Reagan Avon here. She is the co-founder and CEO of Align AI, a knowledge management platform helping companies sustainably transform their organizations to effectively build and use artificial intelligence. In addition to that, Reagan has built an extensive community, as you can see here today, of analytics and data experts through Women in Analytics. It's a global organization, as you have all heard earlier today, founded in 2016. And its mission really is to provide the visibility to diverse individuals making an impact in this space. She hosts a global conference. It's taking place in July. This is our first, as you can tell, satellite event. And she's put 250 women on stage. So I know that was mentioned earlier today, but I think that's a really impressive stat. So can we get a round of applause? Thank you. And we have a community of over 5,000 members. So overall, I think you've done a wonderful job. Moving on to our next panelist here, we have Caitlin Raymond. She is our America's Transformation Lead at Google Cloud. She's a business leader and who's very passionate about empowering people and companies to improve their communities and world by harnessing digital and data by fueling that 10x innovation. Prior to Google, she co-founded and led UBAC, which is a fintech company revolutionizing the way individuals and companies give to their favorite nonprofits. Earlier in her career, she spent a decade with Accenture, most recently serving as the North American lead for financial services organization transformation. And prior to that, she was a journalist as well. So all over the place, which is great. You'll bring a wonderful perspective to this panel. Next, we have Julie Evanson, and she is an engagement editor for the Oregonian newspaper here in Portland. She is a very experienced journalist and has worked as a producer, editor, data analyst in newspapers, digital-only media, agency settings with corporate clients as well. And last but not least, we have Victoria Price-Doucet. She is the director of data and analytics at Slalom, a leader with deep experience in supply chain operations and analytics, innovation, and cross-functional enterprise data strategy. Prior to joining Slalom in 2022, her career spanned across the retail space, technology, defense, and even physical sciences. So she really brings a really broad experience and diverse asset to this conversation. So that's wrapping up our introductions. And just to frame our panel here and how I've constructed our questions is we have different themes or clusters per se. So starting off with looking at the organization and the company and what needs to change to really successfully adopt AI into those practices. And then we also have the people element, which you guys have heard much of today, and we'll dive into more people-oriented questions. Third, we'll go into some challenges that are being faced and really how can we accomplish those and face them. And then last but not least, looking at the future. So we want to leave here with inspiration, right? Not leave on a dull note. So starting off here, I'm going to hand the first question off to Victoria. So what are some of the key foundational pieces an organization needs to have in place in order to fully leverage AI?
That's a great question.
I think there are some really obvious answers in terms of the right skill set, the right infrastructure. Something that tends to be an afterthought are things like really quality data, garbage in, garbage out. Your data needs to be clean, you need to understand it. If that means setting up data governance committees, understanding how data governance applies to all of this, that's really key. Understanding your business objectives. The number of times I've heard, well, we want to use AI to do something is staggering. And so really knowing your business stakeholders, knowing your business challenges, what are you trying to solve for with this? Don't start with a tool and work backwards, start with a challenge and a problem. And really know business process, business logic, and work all of that into how you approach this problem. And I think that the third thing that's really key is being agile and making decisions. Fail fast. This is something that requires significant, tremendous investment. You are almost certainly going to get it wrong the first many, many times, and really being comfortable with having a point where you're just like, nope, this isn't working, let's start over and try something new, and embracing that, which is very, very uncomfortable for a lot of companies to do. Yeah.
Great, thank you for highlighting. I mean, I have experienced the same, you know. As an AI product manager, I don't know how many times I've come into conversations of, I want AI, right? It's like, do you? Is that really what you need? So I completely agree. All right, moving on to the next question. I will hand this one off to you, Reagan. How are organizations really preparing for AI? So we see, I mean, different softwares that have AI baked into them. We have, you know, different conversations with business partners, but how do you really prep an organization to be ready for it?
Yeah, and this question is so different at every single company that I've encountered and that we've worked with. Some organizations, and I kind of explain this in a couple of different ways. So we work with both with very large enterprise organizations and also AI native companies or tech startups that started their culture, started their company and their idea and value proposition on the basis of AI. And so the cultural differences between the two really and largely are, you've got a company that's been around for over 50 years, doing what they do best, whether they're a bank or a retailer, and they're seeing this as a kind of tack on the side, you know, capability. So we've got numbers to meet, revenue to generate, and shareholders to respond to. And so this is kind of this like massive machine that they just kind of tacked on or thinking about tacking on AI to the side of. And so that makes it very, very different. That means that priorities are very different. So if a model goes down in an AI native company, that's a big deal. If a model goes down at a company that's just starting to adopt it, it's not that big of a deal. It wasn't doing that much anyway. We were just running it or experimenting with it. We can work around it. We have processes to lean on. And so it really does take this large cultural shift to start embedding AI into the critical operations and functions of a company. And it starts small. It starts with experimentation, and it starts with a value proposition and framing up how AI can actually provide tons of value to a company. And there's a whole element, we've talked all day about this, risk management, and approaching it from that perspective. And so I think most companies that are doing it well have some sort of AI fluency or literacy program where we're actually teaching people, you don't have to understand how it works under the hood, but understand these, you know, these 4 or 5 fundamental elements of it. Understand these layers of abstraction around it, on how you can embed this into the decision-making process of what you do day to day. So the companies that do it really well, they are thinking about this as a culture shift. They're thinking about how we can start embedding this into critical elements of the organization. And then you have all the infrastructure that needs to be in place, that if that model goes down, that's a big deal. So that's kind of some of the observations that I've seen over time.
I cannot relate more. That is incredible, right? Like, just that one tidbit of you saying, like, as a AI like, native first company versus, say, an organization that has been around for some years and it's more of a tack on element, that is very apparent throughout the world, right? Great. Then moving on to the next question, I'm going to hand this one off to you, Julie. So this will be a little bit more specific. So do industries that function as critical sources of information, like news and other media, have policies in place to govern the use of AI technologies? What are they? Do you know how you expect them to change?
So this is something that has really become a conversation quickly for media as AI has gotten faster and better at synthesizing information. It's really become something that we've had to deal with head on. So as journalists, like, what's a fair way to use AI in reporting, in gathering visuals, or the stuff that we do day to day that's kind of our bread and butter. And a lot of organizations have begun to come up with more formal policies, and this has literally just happened within the last month. So it's moving very quickly, and right now what seems fair is to use AI to craft coverage, to gather information, but in a way that's really transparent. So you have to be able to trust that the people who are gathering that information for you and synthesizing it for you are doing it in a way where we're exposing our sources the same way that we would quote somebody in an article. So, and I don't know how that's going to change. I think as the technology evolves, that is going to become an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. We all know that saying, fake news, right? So
Right.
we want to,
Right.
It's hard not to these days. So you got to be knowledgeable about it, that's for sure. I'll hand this one off to you, Caitlin. Just leading off of that, the trust that goes into AI, right? And what is needed to really drive adoption from like an organization perspective, but also just from like a general consumer perspective too.
Yeah, it's a super good question, and I think it's really timely based on a lot of the news that we're seeing today. And I think that, from an internal perspective, we work with companies and their executive teams to try to solve and answer some of these questions as we're thinking about their journey to the cloud and really adopting artificial intelligence over time. And I think some of the things that tend to surface to the top of the best in breed or the best in class are really organizations that commit first and foremost to a user-centric value proposition. Employees have to feel like they are being empowered, or users are being empowered, or consumers are being empowered by the work that you're doing through AI. It has to be at the front and center of ultimately the strategy and really the conversation and the dialogue and the change management that happens around that initiative. And I think that that's the first step to really building trust. I think the other components that we see are really ensuring that you have transparency, helping people understand the explainable AI, right? Like, how is the model working? Why is it pulling off of certain data sets? How is it being formulated to really create the response and the answer that we're seeing from the model itself? And then I think the other piece of it is really the feedback loop. And I think some of us take that for granted. We start a project, we ultimately establish a mission, an objective, we build it, we test it, we launch it, we iterate. But then the feedback loop really has to be critical. And it's not only critical during the programmatic part of what you're doing when you're building it, but on an ongoing basis. And it doesn't matter whether the feedback's coming from an internal audience or an external audience. They have to know that when they interact with it and they provide feedback, that there's actually some legitimacy behind that. Not that you have to absorb all of the feedback that you receive, but there has to be some mechanism where they feel like their voice is heard, and they ultimately are empowered to help craft, create, and shift that for the better, and ultimately for its ultimate purpose.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that too, I think what's so fascinating is that we're in this very interesting time with AI where we're all being exposed to it in kind of a raw way. Whereas, again, when the internet came out or when search came out, those things have now been little by little abstracted away from us, lower and lower and lower into the stack. And so I think what we're going to see, based on exactly what you just said, is this user experience focus. This is the time for people to start building tools and products and experiences on top of it that expose the transparency elements that are important for end users. We've seen social media try to get more and more in that direction as well. But just every single technological revolution, those very nuanced, hard to understand things start to get lower and lower and lower in the stack and abstracted away from the end users. And I think we're in the very, very early beginnings of that.
I'll add a little bit to that as well in that same vein. One thing that I've seen be really powerful is how do you make creating models even be accessible to anybody, and have seen projects work really well where there's creating a UI on top of training a model, testing a model that anybody, this is in a very different, this is in the hydrographic industry, but Anybody who is a surveyor on a boat can start training this model, annotating data with a really intuitive, well-designed user interface. And it's, all the magic is happening under the hood, but there's a level of ownership and buy-in that then happens when they're part of that process. And you kind of really significantly reduce that barrier to entry by making, anybody can be a part of all of this. And it's not just something that you throw over the fence to data scientists and then hope you get something meaningful and useful back.
Yeah, that's awesome, Victoria. I would +1, both comments there. Yes, very important stuff.
Yeah, it's very relatable. I feel like I just keep saying, I can't agree more, right? So moving on to the next question, I'm going to pass it back off to you, Victoria. What are some of the biggest misconceptions around AI and its implementation?
Ooh. I think the biggest one is that it's magic. It's magical, it's a silver bullet. The story that always makes me laugh is at a previous employer, there were some disagreements, misalignments around business process, around something in supply chain. And my boss at the time said to me, well, AI will tell us what the process should be and tell us how to fix our supply chain. And I printed a screenshot of that Geico ad that's like, that's not how that works. That's not how any of this works. And had it on my office door for a very long time. And it speaks to that education component and to that literacy component. And there's also such a value in that, in having leaders be educated and have an idea of this concept so that they can really effectively make asks and understand where there's real value add here and level set expectations. So I think that idea that it's this magic thing that is going to solve everything, and it also speaks to that well, it's going to do something. There has to be an objective function. What do you want it to do? And I think the other one is that it will make better decisions than people. And you're often training it on data that is in some way created, influenced by people and their behavior. That you're going to have outputs that are really reflective of that input and that human element to it. And so if you're feeding it flawed data that's built on bad behavior, you're going to get bad behavior out. You're going to amplify bad behavior. You're going to continue bad behavior. It's not going to suddenly tell you how to fix that bad behavior. So I think those are the really top two that come to mind for me in terms of having seen, house-built stuff trying to be applied in new areas in different industries.
Yes. Sorry, choking a little bit there. Dry throat. Yes, completely agree. And that pretty much wraps up our company-related questions and organizational transformation. And with that, as we've learned here today, the people element is very important, right? How can they benefit from it? And that human-centric value proposition that Caitlin mentioned earlier today, and how that can really deliver the greatest value. So I'm going to hand this off to Caitlin. How do you build a transformation plan that keeps that human-centric value proposition center stage throughout your entire journey?
It's easier said than done, at its core. But we really feel that it comes down to 3 things that we try to do with executive teams. The first of which is the journey, and I think you've all sort of touched on this at one point, has to start with research. And it has to start with really understanding if it's something that we're trying to solve from the employee side. It's really putting together a super thoughtful discovery approach around the needs of those users. And trying to avoid us injecting our hypotheses into that discovery, really keeping it open-ended with the sort of what and how mindset around the topic that we're working around. Then with those sort of user insights and the research that we've done, it's then sort of architecting, okay, the how might we or how could we type approach and framing up what is that user-centric value proposition. So as an example, we were working with a major retailer here in the United States, and they came to us and they were really jazzed about connected devices and connected products that they could bring back into the homes of the individuals that shopped with them. And we said, well, tell us a little bit more about that. What is really the context that you're witnessing? What are the energizing moments that you hear about from your customers? What are they really searching for or looking for from you? And really what it boiled down to is this core value around accessibility and making sure that their products were more accessible for all audiences and all individuals that would be shopping with them. So that really became our mission statement. That was really at the core of why we were focused on AI and connecting connected experiences. And that then carried across the design experience, the testing experience, really all the way through that journey with them. And then there's really, the last piece is making sure that we can keep that when we get into execution. So there's sort of 5 pillars that we think about. The first of which is planning for the user experience, no shocker there, as we're building a user value proposition. The second is how do we then do people empowerment to fuel that? Yes, we're talking about a consumer-driven experience, but the employees really have to be the champion of that, whether they were the retail workers in the store or the individuals that were at the home office designing the products or the teams that were really looking at some of the data pieces. It all works together in sequence. And so we really had to empower and uplift the employees to help them on this journey to really be the best advocates that they could for this. There's then a layer around, obviously, the technology and the data components, the governance components, creating those decision bodies and frameworks to really help us, troubleshoot some of the things that we're working on and make sure that we're getting to the right next best decision. And then last but not least is how do we use this as a platform for ongoing innovation, as we work forward, as an organization. These capabilities, if we get them right, we heard earlier that a lot of, these AI projects don't, they aren't successful, but the ones that are, they really create a new set of possibilities, a new frontier of things that we can do. And so we want to build that into our plan. So those are really some of the things that we think about.
It's a great way to lay it out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? That easy.
Easier said than done, right?
Right?
Yeah. Yep.
But I guess just leading off of that, you mentioned the user experience, and so do you have any examples of how the user experience can become more human with the help of AI?
So we actually, in working with we're working with a travel organization at the moment, and ultimately their challenge in front of them is that they have all of this information that they're sitting on, but they aren't surfacing it right now to the people that are actually interacting with the customers that are showing up at the counter for them. A simple example is you show up at the counter and they should be able to know, what was your last interaction with the travel company? Did you purchase X and Y? Did you go on X and Y trip? They're not able to do that right now. And the feedback that they keep hearing from the field is how frustrating that is. They keep saying, maybe they can wing it. They might remember somebody by their face, and their peers sort of look at them like, oh, wow, Susie's amazing at doing that job, but she's really working off of her intuition and her kind of EQ to provide this experience, when the reality is the data is there. We just need to be able to surface it to them so that they can provide that really personalized, empathetic, connected customer experience that many of their associates are looking to provide, and they struggle to do so just because the information isn't at their fingertips. So while it may not, that particular example may not require the strength of AI per se, but it's just a fundamental representation of the fact that the data and the surfacing of this intelligence can ultimately provide them a better, stronger experience and really up that employee engagement for a multitude of different industries as we see that issue kind of over and over again.
Yeah, absolutely. The customer experience element, it's one of the most, I feel like challenging topics, because it's so hard to measure, it's so hard to really curate, so it's great to have that assistance from a modeling perspective. I'm going to hand this one off to you, Reagan. So what is the concept of artificial hallucination, and why should we be aware of it when interacting with generative AI? What type of implications might this have on our end users?
Yeah, this is such a fun term. I don't know about you guys, but I think the hallucination part is really fun. So basically, this hallucination experience is when you interact with some kind of generative AI, and it provides information back to you that appears to be true on the surface, but actually is incorrect. And if you're following a lot of these interactivities of ChatGPT on Twitter, you'll see a lot of really interesting examples of this. In fact, my friend just stopped by our office the other day, and as his party trick, he's been putting people's names in ChatGPT, and it comes back with who you are and if they can find you kind of in the resources. And it said I was a data scientist, which I am not actually a data scientist. It also said that I own a different conference, which I do not. And so it appears to be true. It's maybe close to being true, but it's not actually true. We were actually just talking about this in the speaker room. So I think this is a super interesting situation that we're going through, and we're going to go through even more. So you had mentioned kind of this misinformation, fake news kind of dilemma that we've found ourselves in, and it's getting amplified by a lot of these platforms that we're interfacing with. But the unfortunate news is that is probably going to get worse, because generative AI can start to produce these things called hallucinations, as I just mentioned, which give people a false perception of something they believe to be true. So it's not just people now spreading misinformation, it is these systems now spreading misinformation. And there has to be ways for us to battle this. And I know that there have been multiple technologies mentioned that can identify whether or not an essay, as an example stated earlier, was generated by ChatGPT, but this is going to be yet another whole distraction for people, and something to be hyper aware of. This is a generative AI, so it's creating things. It's not a search engine. I know we're headed in that direction, but it's not. You're not searching things on the internet and getting something back. It is generating something for you. And so I just think that this is a very important topic that people should be aware of when they're interacting with these platforms. And I don't know if anybody wants to add on to that specifically.
Yeah, I can.
If you want to talk about what the implications are too from a news perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are a ton, but your specific example about putting somebody's name into one of these tools and getting some results back, one of the things that industry-wide sparked media organizations to start crafting these very specific rules of engagement with AI is the editor-in-chief of Wired put a bunch of queries into, I think it was ChatGPT, in a use case of we want to do a nationwide story about homicide rates in cities around the country. And what he got back was something that looked very real about homicide rates in LA, Chicago, wherever, with footnotes. But when he went to click the link on the footnote, the articles didn't exist. The AI tool created them itself. So that's the sort of thing that it looks very factual, but the AI is just trying to give you what you expect, and it doesn't have any facts actually behind it yet.
Yep.
I'm curious, Victoria, and from a consulting perspective, what kind of questions, from clients, are you getting questions around ChatGPT or anything along those lines?
There's been locally, no, not a lot. I think people are still it's a little bit of a party trick. It's a novelty thing at this point. There's been a lot of, jokes in our office about can it do our jobs better than we can? Can we use it to craft emails and save ourselves some time? But I think it's something that there's still that element of distrust, or also I think people probably aren't really admitting that they're doing this to craft emails or, write school essays like my daughter. So I think it's early yet, and I think it's people getting their feet wet and getting familiar with is this what AI is, and how can I use this? It's still very much a novelty. But I've been a little bit surprised that we have not gotten more questions about it.
Yeah, it's so interesting because ChatGPT, I think, made it mainstream. It made it real-ish to people. And it's funny because my co-founder sent me this Instagram reel of this hilarious 90s commercial for the internet where a bunch of kids are you can look up recipes for cat cupcakes on the internet. And there's crazy techno music playing behind it. I feel like we're at that stage of AI. We're still really trying to figure out what is it, what can it do. Companies are trying to understand are we going to lose competitive advantage if another company figures this out before us? We just saw a bunch of examples about how technology companies are integrating this into their tech stack, which is really fascinating. I'm sure you've got tons of examples of that as well at Google. And so I do think we're just super, super early in terms of what this is going to look like, which is a little crazy because people are interfacing with technology that uses AI every single day. But as I mentioned, it's just further down the stack. And now I think people are starting to understand this new wave of generative AI from a more like real touch it, play with it, send a text, get something back.
And I think an interesting thought on that is people are right now trying to figure out, and I can just picture that boss that was like, well, won't it tell me what's wrong? Like, he's like, this is the answer. I can ask ChatGPT what's wrong with my supply chain. Or, where should I place my inventory? And so I think there's going to be an interesting sort of, people are trying to figure out, like, how can I actually apply this to my business, and learning that, like, this is one form of AI, and it's not necessarily the only form of AI. And so, like, creating, creating content might not necessarily be something that's actually directly applicable to your business, but people who are just now kind of engaging with this technology are trying to unravel that and figure out what that means.
Absolutely.
And Victoria, we get a lot of your, we want to use Gen AI, and we're like, to what end?
For what?
Like, for what? And they're like, I don't know, I just want to use it. And we're like, okay, well, let's talk about that.
I want it to be a magic 8-ball.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it will answer the question, but will it be right?
And you brought up a great example back in the 90s. I'm just going to keep building off of that one for you, Julie, here. So online search had an outsized effect on news media, particularly local news, in the 2000s. Now search companies are baking AI into their search engines. What effects do you see AI search having on news, advertising, and other ways people consume this information?
So I think it will actually be really helpful in terms of serving people content that they're interested in. But the downstream effect of that is if people are only engaging with content that they like, then they might actually be missing content that they need. And so we've seen already with some of these AI tools that are out there, engagement goes up, clicks go up. But things are so siloed already and so polarized that while that's maybe good for us as an industry, I think we have to solve for making sure that people are engaging with sources that challenge them and not just stuff that they're comfortable with.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting too. We were messing around with LinkedIn earlier, and I was looking at the settings. I didn't realize there was a setting that you can turn off political content in LinkedIn. So if you're sick of seeing it, there is an option. I just discovered that today, and I think that that's kind of an example of the way that people are trying to maybe put more power into the hands of the end users, where I want to be able to control the content that I'm seeing in a way that, or I want settings. I feel like we're going to start moving towards that, in that direction, where I can start giving you kind of explicit settings on how I want to engage with this platform and give you more information other than just kind of the subtle subliminal behavioral information that it's picking up on. How can I course correct this thing? Because it can really get out of control. Like you can start, we were talking about, you can search one thing and then it thinks you want that for like 6 months. And it's like, I'm sick of seeing those videos. I don't want to see that anymore. And so I do think there's going to be such a fascinating move to like put more power into the hands of the end consumer, even if it is a little manual.
I'm sure everyone has felt like, is my phone listening to me? Like I was just talking about this and now I have this ad for this new pair of shoes that I was, it's just crazy how intelligent, I guess, they can be. So that concludes our people-oriented questions. We're gonna move into some challenges. So, throughout the course of the day, we've learned about, AI roadmaps, steps to get there, the journey, but there's usually a path of most resistance in that. So we're going to talk about what those challenges can be. So I'll hand this off to Reagan. What are some of the risks associated with using AI, and how can companies and individuals assess these risks appropriately?
Yeah, I don't want to repeat all of the really goodness that we heard in each of the talks from earlier today. I think just to mention a couple of different frameworks, one was mentioned earlier, but NIST and ISO are coming up with these frameworks or standards that companies can use to their advantage to start putting in place. I think the harder part about all of this in terms of risk management is operationalizing it. Like you had mentioned these 5 steps, which is so great, but then how do companies scale that? How do they take that internally and operationalize that on an ongoing basis? It is so incredibly hard. This is kind of like the people and process problem. So and it might start to think, I don't know about anybody here, but like I listen to a lot of these topics a lot, and it almost starts to sound like an echo chamber of us saying like, here's what you need to do, here's a framework, here are the things that you need to implement. And yet we're still having these conversations because the change that needs to happen is more of an operational change. And when we're looking at risk, where it literally comes down to what tests are we running? Do we have a staging environment where we can run this model for 6 months and see what kinds of outputs it would make? And can we simulate an environment and see what kinds of risks we need to look for, or the downfalls of a model over time before we productionalize it and impact real people? And just something like that. And I think it's also a top-down initiative, which I know we heard earlier today as well. Does your board and leadership of your company understand some of these issues, implications, and risks? And are they willing to prioritize and put the right people in place to maintain that and operationalize that and audit that internally? And now we're starting to see governments step in. And the EU is passing a lot of legislature, and so is Canada, to try to start enforcing a lot of these practices onto companies. I keep calling it the GDPR for AI, but I might be way off. But it's kind of that paradigm shift where now we're putting some more responsibility on companies, saying you have to be more transparent, you have to be able to let the end consumer know what's happening and why certain decisions are being made. And these have implications internally. It creates new roles at companies that they're not used to and they don't know how to write job descriptions for. They don't know what they don't know, and so that's a problem. And we start seeing some of these companies put ethical committees together with people with all sorts of different backgrounds, technologists, ethicists, sociologists. So I think it's more of a culture problem that it's like, what do we do? Because I think we kind of know what to do. Like, we've got a lot of really good examples out there.
Yeah, and I guess another question building off of that, you mentioned the organizations where it feels like AI is just slapped on, right? So do you see any differences between like an AI native organization versus like a large organization that's doing AI?
Yeah, I actually think the larger companies are being more cautious in moving than maybe some of these AI native companies, because they're trying to move fast and break things, right? Mm-hmm. They're motivated to do that. And so I actually see a lot more process or thoughtfulness happening at some of the larger organizations because they are being more cautious about it. Which seems counterintuitive, but that's kind of those are the patterns that we've been observing.
That's great to hear. All right, so I'm going to hand the next question off to Julie. Are there any early examples of how AI might be used or misused to disseminate information online, say about politics or health or other critical topics?
So I think I'll start with a case of use, because there's a lot of cases of misuse and they're a little bit less fun. The way that a lot of media organizations are using AI tools right now is to surface content to people that we are making a bet that they're going to be interested in, and to get them to continue to engage with us and to subscribe to, if it's a newspaper, TV does it a little bit differently. But those contact points, AI allows us to, facilitate relationships with people, keep them coming back, keep them getting good information, and establishing ourselves as a resource for trusted information. So I feel like that's a really good use case for AI. On the other hand, as I was prepping for this, I kept picking an example of the misuse, and then another one would happen, and another one would happen. There was an AI-generated deep fake video in the Chicago mayor's race that didn't really have an impact on it because it wasn't very good yet. But then within the next few weeks of that happening, I don't know if anybody was on Twitter on Tuesday and saw the AI-generated photos of former President Donald Trump being arrested. They were very good. They were very good. If there weren't a couple tells in those, you probably would have thought they were real. So, and I'm not sure we have the tools yet to really seek those out and be able to educate people about what to look for and why they're fake.
Yes, leading off of that, like, do you see an urgency? So is who and what and how?
Yes, I mean, we're headed into a general election year in 2024. This is gonna get sophisticated quickly. It's already pretty sophisticated, and we're in a misinformation environment already. And I do feel a sense of urgency headed into some pretty critical political times in our country to be able to give people proper information. And what some of this misinformation does is make people question what they see. So you might know that that one is fake, but then what about the next one? And who's the authority? Who do you go to get that confirmation of, did that thing really happen? And I don't think we've solved that yet.
I hope we do soon. All right, so leading into the next question, I'll hand this one off to you, Victoria. So what are some of the biggest issues with accelerating development or usage of AI in the enterprise? And if you could come up with just a couple examples of what you've seen. I mean, you provided us some already, but just any additional ones.
I think it comes back to people, and there's the data element, there's your tech stack, but it's very frequently you have organizations, teams who don't know how to work together, who don't trust each other, who don't have a way to clearly prioritize and figure out how to divvy up capacity. There's very rarely change management put into place. It's always an afterthought, and it's usually when stuff is already hitting the fan. Like, maybe we should communicate about this a little bit better. I think it's all of those people elements that when we are talking about technology and applications of technology are an afterthought, and it's always harder to think about these things when things are already going haywire, when things are already going sideways. And so I think thinking about organizational effectiveness, change management, transition management, these are all things that need to be first and not last. And so thinking about that bigger picture and who are all the people that need to be involved in creating this, in testing, and who are going to be the end users, who are going to be impacted by the end users. I think those are sort of the key things that really slow an effort down, because you can have brilliant data scientists, great data, a marvelously scalable tech stack, and if you have wildly dysfunctional teams and team dynamics behind it, you are never going to get anywhere.
And I think, Victoria, just to build on that, I think I'm a bit of a neuroscience geek, and what's really fascinating about this dysfunction that we see sometimes within teams is that basically the reaction in our brains when we feel excluded or not involved in a decision that impacts us is actually the same reaction in our bodies as if we were to stub our toe on the bedpost. And so just think about that as leaders of teams, as you're architecting these really strategic initiatives. Being thoughtful in the beginning pays dividends because you're actually giving people the reaction that's consistent with physical harm when they feel isolated or not included in these programs in the beginning.
I think one of the things that makes it challenging is it's hard to know what good looks like, at least in terms of, you have a vision of good in your head, but it's hard to articulate. It's like the classic problem of describing to somebody how to make a peanut butter sandwich. You think at a very high level of how teams work well together, how all of these sort of softer people elements should be, but actually getting to how to do that tactically is very, very challenging. Getting good data, that's pretty cut and dry in terms of what that needs to look like. Having a good tech stack, that's pretty cut and dry in terms of what that looks like. But that spectrum of emotional intelligence that's required to really do this well is something that you might have significant gaps that are blind spots that are much harder to identify early in the process.
Yeah, I think that's a very nice kind of dovetail into this idea that we're going to be replaced by AI in the near future. Like if our hardest problem is not a technical problem, but it's a people problem, I think that's very telling. Like we could build all the technology, we can pump a ton of venture capital into all this tech stack that enables people to do very incredible things with AI. But at the end of the day, it's always a people challenge. And I think that's also super telling.
I'm also curious with you, Reagan, from an educational perspective and really upskilling the organization, but also from like a leadership point of view as well. Because one thing that stuck with me with Pradnya's speech or talk was around like the active sponsor and like really getting that top-down support and the culture element. So I'm curious from your experience so far, what you have seen from the education perspective.
Yeah, I mean, there's some interesting trends that companies are starting. I was just sitting on a CDO roundtable, and every single CDO there said, number one problem is culture. Number two problem is talent. Like, those are the two things that are keeping them up at night over and over and over again, which I think is really interesting. And so how do we address this? When you're talking about upskilling, like, what do we start with? And I can tell you it's not Python training. I know it's tempting, but it's not. And so a lot of these companies are starting to think of, okay, can we create some people don't like the word literacy program or fluency program, whatever you want to call it. The idea of it is, can we create an educational program tailored to different roles inside of the organization that gives them an understanding of their part in the bigger ecosystem? Every single role up to the CEO is a data role now, in some way, shape, or form. They may not be building models, but they have to interface with data in some way, shape, or form. And so these literacy or fluency programs, I think, are going to be really important. I mean, if you work at a larger organization, especially a highly regulated one of the first things you go through is this pretty intense kind of training, right? Phishing campaigns, hey, don't click on this email. If you see it, report it here. Like, we've got these kind of risk mitigation plans in place to ensure people know the right thing, they can address the right thing, they can see the right thing. And that is the number one thing that every single employee will get exposure to when they start at a company. And I think they're starting to think that this is also that. Like AI and data fluency is going to be that important, that every single person onboarded to a company knows their role in the entire ecosystem, the process, understands the ethics behind it, understands the fundamentals about it, and is educated to a basic level, and then can navigate the organization appropriately if there are issues, down to clicking the button at the top like, hey, this is a phishing email. That we've got to get to that level of operationalization for these types of kind of upskilling, culture shifts, educational shifts.
I cannot agree more. But building off of that, we've been talking about all these challenges, and yeah, it sounds really rough. So are there any resources available to address these challenges, and do you know of a company that's doing it right?
I'll touch on the resources, and in the spirit of this also being a conference focused on giving more women visibility, I will also give you a recommendation of 4 women you should follow immediately. So a couple of the organizations I mentioned, so NIST has the AI risk framework. ISO is also coming up with and publishing more standards in this space. There's the Responsible AI Institute, which has a membership program if you are a company interested in learning more and getting educated around that. And then the 4 women that I would highly recommend following and engaging with their content, because they put out really good educational information. So Noelle Silver, she's incredible. She just launched the generative AI program at Accenture. And she is an unbelievable individual, super technical, great background, really great at talking about complicated, technical topics. Was one of the early contributors to Alexa, and she is amazing. Elizabeth Adams, also a very influential ethicist focused on ethics in the AI space. Renee Cummings is another ethicist that's amazing as well. And then Carol Piovesan, who is an AI lawyer. She works at, I think it's IQ, I'm going to get this wrong, a law firm. If you look her up, you'll find her law firm. They're very focused on legal implications of AI and how do we help organizations navigate this, so we can't just claim negligence. And we can't claim that we didn't know or we didn't understand the implications of what we were building. So those are 4 women that I highly recommend people look up and follow, and then a couple of organizations as well.
That sounds, I guess, I can maybe add an example from one of the customers that we're working with, and it gets to your point of operationalizing this and really focusing on the people side of it. So we were working over the past couple of years with an industrial company, and you don't think of maybe that as being the ideal environment for being, sort of best case scenario. But what was fascinating as we went through this journey with them is that their sort of burning platform was driving more customer reliability around the products and services that they put out to the market. And through doing that, they ultimately knew that the must-have was at the core of their operations. They had to drive more automation. And the automation that they had to drive within their operations is some of the most complicated stuff that I've witnessed and sort of played a part in seeing come to life, because it essentially was saying that they needed to take the logistical side of their business and they needed to automate major parts of that. So they needed to know based on weather, based on availability, based on customer demand, based on different traffic patterns, based on container availability, where they could place any given cart at any given time, not to mention the maintenance piece of this and making sure that everything was in tip-top shape to go where it needed to go. So a very daunting task, but it all, again, was in service of this customer reliability and getting to that next best outcome. Well, they actually created a specific task force at the very beginning of the engagement that was not only individuals within their company, but it was also people outside of the industry. So they actually brought in people from healthcare, from financial services, from telecommunications, from other partners that they work with from a supply chain standpoint. And they actually started to architect and design, what does this solution really need to look like? What are the inputs and outputs? How do we really think about it? How do we leverage best practices from other regulated industries, from other pseudo-government type environments, such as the one that they were operating within? And so they established guiding principles out of that were sort of design principles that they were going to design all of this automation around. They then did extensive user testing, research. They had comprehensive teams that were going out to the different yards and basically interviewing people that were in that environment, and not just interviewing like 4 or 5 of them. It essentially was going to 80% of their locations and interviewing at least 1 or 2 or 3 people at each location, so they had a diverse perspective of that. Then ultimately when we got further down in the journey and they actually had some of the automation there, they had sort of a rigorous testing process that actually went through, and they tested the capability in sort of a contained environment. And they brought in this cross-functional group of individuals to help them do that. Then they went out a little bit broader and a little bit broader. So at the end of this, before they actually scaled it to market across their entire organization, they had thousands and thousands of people actually testing this as trusted testers, and they came from those diverse backgrounds. They also ran a change management program. From day one, they had top-down sponsorship from the CEO and the board to actually do this. And so they really had to work hard at that because it was a big culture change. And there were concerns about, are you automating my job away? But when they realized that the billfold they had in the back of their pocket for the day tracking maintenance records cost them another hour at the end of the day, and we could help them eliminate that hour, that was a plus for them, because then they could focus more on the partner piece of it or the customer piece of it and really start to up-level that service to a new point. And this journey will continue for them for years, but they are onto a very promising start based on those strategic moves that they made early.
Yeah, and I think it's so important to highlight success because, you look at numbers like last year, $49 billion was invested in AI initiatives across companies, and 90% of that resulted in nothing. So, it's just, there's a lot getting poured into it, and we're still seeing this promise in little glimpses and still unable to realize that. So I think it is so important to highlight what's going well, how are people doing this well, and a big piece I keep seeing over and over again is this leadership buy-in. It's the thoughtfulness around the change management. So that was such a great example.
I was going to say, I'll put in a shameless plug as a resource for consulting groups. But in all seriousness, most companies are not equipped to undergo this transformation themselves, and having an objective third party come in and talk to you about where are your weak points from an organizational standpoint, like what does that big picture vision need to look like, and what are the puzzle pieces that really form that big picture. From a change management standpoint, an organizational effectiveness standpoint, really that people component, also the data side of things and the technical side. But and then when you realize that some of these puzzle pieces are missing, helping you kind of figure out how you fill those gaps. And so I think reach out for help. And I think another great way to do that is get involved in professional organizations, professional groups. Network and learn what other organizations are doing, what other companies are doing, where are they running into issues, pitfalls, what can everybody learn from each other along this journey, because everybody's kind of at the same point in time, and I think that there's a lot of power in forming those communities as everybody's kind of going along the trip together.
Mm-hmm. And a partner was absolutely part of that journey for the industrial company, so I should have mentioned that. That's a great call, Victoria. Yes, a lot of partner help.
Yeah, it's okay to ask for help.
Yeah.
Right? It's good to ask for help. And concluding our panel, we're not going to have as much time to talk about the inspiration piece in the future, but I would like to pose this to the audience: is where do you see AI in 10 years? And take that question with you to our social hour, which is going to be happening right after this event, and you'll be able to speak with our panelists there. So thank you guys all. Thank you, panelists, for being here today. We really appreciate your time and all of the wonderful perspective you had to add.
Thank you for organizing.
Thank you.
Thank you.